The day I found the notice nailed to my grandmother's cottage door, the world around me shifted. The little house had been part of my family for generations, standing quietly at the edge of the neighborhood long before the manicured lawns and rigid rules of the HOA ever came into existence. Weathered wood, peeling paint, and creaking steps gave it character, and inside, the scent of lavender and old books lingered in every corner. For me, it wasn't just a structure, it was the heart of my childhood. The last physical piece of my grandmother's memory, but the bold red letters stamped across the notice cut through me like a knife. Unfit for habitation, scheduled for demolition. The HOA had decided that Grandma's cottage was an eyesore, unworthy of standing within their carefully curated neighborhood. They called it unsafe, structurally unsound, and non-compliant with their strict architectural code. To them, it was just an old shack that didn't fit their glossy brochures. To me, it was history, love, and legacy. At first, I tried to breathe through the panic. Surely this was a mistake. Grandma's cottage had stood strong for nearly a century, weathering storms and time itself. It wasn't just structurally sound. It was built better than most of the flimsy homes that the HOA approved with open arms. But the board didn't care about history or strength. They cared about uniformity, perfection, and control. I attended the first hearing they scheduled, thinking it would be simple. I would show them the house was safe, present the records of inspections over the years, and they'd have no grounds to demolish it. Instead, I found myself sitting in a cold, sterile room filled with smug faces staring down at me like I was trespassing on their authority. The president of the HOA, a woman named Evelyn, smirked as if she had already won before I even opened my mouth. Their arguments were rehearsed. The cottage lowered property values. The cottage was a danger to the community. The cottage didn't meet aesthetic standards. Each word they spoke felt like another nail in its coffin. No matter what evidence I brought, they dismissed it. No matter what truth I laid out, they countered with technicalities and jargon. By the end of the meeting, they had stamped their approval for demolition. My grandmother's house, my house now, was scheduled to be bulldozed in just 30 days. I walked back to the cottage that night under the weight of defeat. The air smelled faintly of pine, the gravel crunching under my shoes like a drumbeat of inevitability. Inside, I sat in Grandma's old rocking chair, staring at the faded photographs on the walls. She had passed 3 years ago, but her presence lingered in every corner, every scratch on the wooden floors, every stitch of the quilt she had made by hand. Losing the house felt like losing her all over again, but grief quickly hardened into resolve. Something didn't feel right. The HOA's aggression, the speed with which they dismissed my evidence, the smirk on Evelyn's face, it was too polished, too deliberate. This wasn't just about the house being unfit. This was about power, and I suspected there was something they weren't telling me. The next day, I began digging. I started by requesting copies of the HOA's structural reports, the supposed inspections that labeled the cottage unsafe. They delayed, sending me incomplete pages, vague statements with no clear data. When I pressed further, I was met with silence. So I dug deeper, pulling county records, land deeds, and historical surveys, and that's when I noticed something strange. The HOA had filed paperwork to acquire the land beneath the cottage weeks before the demolition notice had even been issued. It was hidden in stacks of zoning updates and redevelopment proposals, but the dates didn't lie. They wanted the land. My grandmother's cottage wasn't just in their way. It was sitting on something they desperately wanted. The question was, why? Late at night, I drove past the HOA's office building, a pristine structure with spotless glass windows and perfectly trimmed hedges. I sat in my car, watching the lights flicker inside as board members worked late hours. They weren't just obsessed with rules. They were hiding something bigger. I couldn't shake the memory of Evelyn's smirk. She wasn't just pleased with a small victory. She looked like someone guarding a secret, confident that I'd never uncover it, but she didn't know me. I wasn't about to let my grandmother's memory be erased. I wasn't about to let the walls that had held generations of my family crumble under the weight of corruption. The HOA thought they were fighting a powerless homeowner. What they didn't realize was that I was prepared to tear open every file, expose every lie, and drag their darkest secret into the light. The cottage wasn't just a house anymore. It was a battlefield, and I had just taken my first step into war. The morning after I discovered the suspicious land documents, I woke with a pounding determination. My grandmother's cottage wasn't just a casualty of some petty aesthetic violation. It was a target. The HOA wanted it gone for reasons far deeper than chipped paint or leaning shutters. The pattern of their behavior began gnawing at me. The speed of the demolition approval, the half-complete structural reports, the way Evelyn, the HOA president, had practically dared me to challenge them. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about beauty. It was about control. I began piecing together the timeline. Months before my grandmother passed away, the HOA had pushed through amendments to the neighborhood's charter. Hidden inside them was a clause granting the board special rights to redevelop land deemed abandoned or unfit. The cottage, even though legally mine, had been quietly labeled as a potential acquisition site. It wasn't neglect they were after, it was the ground it stood on. But why my grandmother's plot? Her land wasn't large. It sat at the very edge of the neighborhood, backed by forest and cut off from the main road. On the surface, it seemed useless. Yet the fact that the HOA went through such calculated effort to seize it told me otherwise. I decided to look closer. The first step was the county office. I spent hours sifting through dusty boxes of old maps, blueprints, and land surveys. And there it was, something that made my stomach tighten. My grandmother's property wasn't just a lonely patch of land. It was built directly above an unused underground well system. Not just any well, but one that connected to natural springs running beneath the neighborhood. In the past, water rights had been a contentious issue in this county. Developers fought over them. Towns had lawsuits spanning decades, and whoever controlled access to clean water had leverage. If the HOA gained ownership of the land, they could potentially exploit those rights, whether for profit, development, or influence over the county council. Suddenly, everything made sense. The HOA wasn't fighting me because of a cottage. They were fighting me because my grandmother's tiny patch of earth sat on the key to something much bigger. But as much as the revelation fueled my anger, it also filled me with dread. These weren't just nosy neighbors writing tickets for overgrown lawns. These were people with money, power, and motives, sharp enough to ruin anyone who stood in their way. I needed proof. That night, I returned to the HOA office under the cover of darkness. The building sat quiet, its glass walls glowing faintly under streetlights. My heart pounded as I circled the perimeter, searching for vulnerabilities. A row of filing cabinets sat visible through the windows on the second floor, and I recognized the labels: land development, water rights, redevelopment projects. Exactly what I needed. I wasn't reckless enough to break in yet. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped photos through the glass, zooming in as much as I could. Pages, stamps, and blueprints were just barely visible. Enough to confirm my suspicion. The HOA wasn't just managing a neighborhood. They were orchestrating a land grab. Still, blurry photos wouldn't win in court. I needed hard evidence, so I turned to people who knew the board better than anyone, the residents. At first, no one wanted to talk. Fear hung heavy over the neighborhood like an invisible fence. The HOA had fined them for garden gnomes, forced them to repaint shutters, even threatened foreclosure over unpaid fees. Everyone knew someone who had suffered under their iron fist. But when I mentioned my grandmother's cottage, something shifted. Quiet whispers turned into cautious admissions. One elderly neighbor recalled surveyors showing up late at night, measuring land without notice. Another mentioned HOA meetings being closed door, despite rules requiring them to be public. A young couple confessed they'd received mysterious letters pressuring them to sell their property. Letters they suspected came from Evelyn herself. piece by piece, the facade of perfection cracked. Beneath the manicured lawns and pristine fences lay a trail of intimidation and corruption. But gathering testimonies wasn't enough. The HOA operated with polished paperwork and ironclad rules. To beat them, I needed to find the one thing they couldn't explain away, the secret they'd buried so deep they thought no one would ever uncover it. The answer came sooner than I expected. One neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, handed me a faded envelope he claimed had been slipped into his mailbox by mistake years ago. Inside was a letter addressed to Evelyn, stamped with the county seal. It referenced exclusive development rights and compensation agreements tied directly to my grandmother's land. The wording was vague, but the implication was clear. The HOA had struck deals behind closed doors. That letter was the crack I needed. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following week. I knew Evelyn would be there, leading her circle of loyal board members, basking in her false authority. I also knew that if I walked in empty-handed, I'd be crushed again under their rules and technicalities. But with enough proof, enough witnesses, and enough leverage, I could expose them in front of the very people they pretended to serve. The challenge was timing. 30 days had shrunk to 24, and the demolition crew had already been contracted. Every hour mattered. As I sat once again in my grandmother's rocking chair, holding the faded letter in trembling hands, I felt the weight of her presence. She had fought to keep this cottage during wars, depressions, and storms. Now it was my turn to fight, not just for her memory, but for the truth that could bring the entire HOA crashing down. The board thought they had cornered me. They thought I was just another powerless homeowner they could intimidate into submission. But what they didn't realize was that their own secrets had already begun to rot beneath the surface, and I was ready to dig them up for everyone to see. The stage was set. The board meeting would either be the day they silenced me forever, or the day I pulled back the curtain on everything they'd tried to hide. The week leading up to the HOA board meeting felt like walking on a tightrope stretched over fire. Every day that passed brought the demolition date closer, and every night I pored over documents, testimonies, and scraps of evidence, piecing together the web the HOA had spun. The faded letter from the county to Evelyn sat on my desk like a weapon, its words vague yet damning. Combined with whispers from neighbors and my discovery of the underground water system, I was beginning to see the full picture. The HOA wasn't just exercising authority. They were exploiting it, using rules as camouflage for greed. But suspicion wasn't enough. I needed undeniable proof, something so clear the board couldn't spin it, something that would shatter their carefully polished image in front of the residents who feared them. So I prepared. I organized the testimonies, scanned every document, and created a timeline that exposed the contradictions in their story. I printed old county maps, showing the springs beneath the cottage land, and highlighted the zoning amendments that conveniently aligned with their attempts to seize it. Each piece alone looked like coincidence. Together, they looked like conspiracy. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the cottage's living room, the walls heavy with memories. My grandmother's quilt lay across my lap, and I could almost hear her voice urging me to fight, to stand tall no matter the odds. The weight of legacy pressed on me, but so did the fear. What if I failed? What if I walked into that room and they laughed me out again, dismissing every shred of evidence I had? But as dawn broke, I knew there was no turning back. The board meeting was held in the neighborhood's pristine community center, a building the HOA loved to show off during open houses. Its glass doors gleamed, its floors polished to a shine, and every chair was aligned in perfect rows. But beneath the perfection was tension. Residents filed in quietly, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. Many had their own grievances with the HOA, but few dared to speak. They came for spectacle, maybe for hope, but not to challenge. At the front sat the board, lined up like judges. Evelyn presided in the center, her smile tight and cold, her eyes sharp with the confidence of someone who thought they already won. She tapped a pen against her folder as if daring me to approach. When my name was called, I rose from my seat, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Every step toward the podium echoed through the room. I laid my papers down, inhaled deeply, and began. I started with the obvious. The notice of demolition. The so-called structural reports that lacked signatures and dates. The contradictions between what the HOA claimed and what county inspections had shown in the past. Evelyn shifted in her seat, but her smile didn't falter. She was waiting for me to run out of steam, but I didn't. I moved to the zoning amendments, laying out copies for the residents to see. I pointed to the clauses granting the HOA redevelopment rights. I showed them the timeline of when those amendments were filed, weeks before my grandmother's cottage had ever been labeled unsafe. Murmurs spread through the crowd, whispers rising like wind through trees. Still, Evelyn smirked, her voice finally cutting through speculation, misinterpretation. None of this changes the fact that the property is unsafe. That was when I revealed the letter. I held it up high, the faded paper trembling only slightly in my hands. "This," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "is a letter from the county addressed directly to Evelyn. It references exclusive development rights tied to my grandmother's land. Rights that should never have been granted to an HOA in the first place." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelyn's smile vanished for the first time, her jaw tightening as her fingers gripped the edge of the table. I pressed on, louder now, feeding on the momentum. "This isn't about safety. This isn't about community standards. This is about profit. The HOA wants my grandmother's land because it sits on top of a natural spring system. Control that land, and they control water rights for the entire area." The room erupted in murmurs, anger, disbelief. Residents exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others glaring at the board. Evelyn pounded her gavel, demanding order, but the crack in her facade was clear. I laid out the testimonies. Neighbors intimidated, surveys conducted in secret, letters pressuring families to sell. Each account added weight to the growing pile of evidence. Each piece chipped away at the board's authority, and then silence fell. For a moment, the room held its breath, waiting for the board's rebuttal. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice sharp and icy. She dismissed the testimonies as unreliable, the maps as outdated, the letter as irrelevant. But the desperation in her tone betrayed her. The confidence she had wielded so easily was cracking, and the residents could see it. For the first time, the board didn't look untouchable. They looked cornered. I stepped back from the podium, my chest heaving, my eyes locked on Evelyn's. She glared at me with a venomous intensity, but beneath it was fear. Not of me, but of the truth I had dragged into the light. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Residents clustered in groups, their voices sharp with anger, their questions loud and unrelenting. Evelyn stormed out with the other board members trailing behind, their polished image unraveling under the weight of suspicion. I returned to the cottage that night exhausted but alive with fire. I hadn't won, not yet. The demolition order still stood, and Evelyn was too powerful to crumble after one confrontation. But the seed had been planted. The residents had seen the cracks. The HOA's darkest secret had begun to seep into daylight, and no amount of polished words could shove it back underground. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it had only just begun, because if Evelyn and the board were willing to go this far for my grandmother's land, I knew they were hiding even more. And I intended to dig until I unearthed every last piece of their corruption. The night after the board meeting, I barely slept. The cottage creaked with the sounds of wind against its aging beams, but each groan felt like a warning, a reminder of the storm I had stirred. I had exposed the HOA's darkest secret to the residents, and though it wasn't yet enough to stop the demolition, it was enough to shake Evelyn's iron grip. But power doesn't slip easily from hands like hers. The retaliation began the very next morning. I woke to find a fresh notice taped to the cottage door, this time claiming I owed thousands in back dues and administrative penalties. Charges I had never seen before: piled with interest, threatening liens on my property. It was intimidation, plain and simple. They couldn't silence me in the boardroom, so they tried to bury me in paperwork and fear. I tore the notice down, my hands shaking with fury. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. That day, as I walked the neighborhood, I noticed eyes following me. Not the curious, hopeful gazes of residents after the meeting, but sharp, wary stares from those loyal to Evelyn. A car I didn't recognize idled near the edge of my grandmother's property. At night, headlights flickered down the road, lingering longer than they should. The HOA wasn't just flexing its legal muscles. They were reminding me they had other ways to make life unbearable. Still, intimidation only fueled my resolve. If anything, it confirmed I had struck a nerve. And that meant I was closer to the truth than they wanted me to be. I doubled down on my research. In the county archives, I dug through decades-old council minutes, land transfers, and development proposals. What I found painted a chilling picture. The HOA had been expanding its influence for years, systematically targeting older properties that stood on land rich with resources, wells, mineral rights, even timber. My grandmother's cottage was only the latest in a long line of acquisitions. Families who resisted found themselves buried under fines, lawsuits, or sudden violations that forced them out. One by one, their homes disappeared, replaced by new developments or absorbed into HOA-controlled property. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about empire, but to prove it, I needed more than scattered records. I needed a smoking gun, a direct link tying Evelyn and the board to the deals they had orchestrated. That link came in the form of an unexpected ally. Late one evening, as I sat in the cottage sorting through papers, there was a knock at the door. My heart raced. Neighbors rarely visited, especially after the board. When I opened it, I found a man standing in the shadows. His face was tense, his eyes darting nervously toward the road. He introduced himself as Daniel, a former board member who had resigned years ago under mysterious circumstances. He had been at the meeting, watching silently from the back. And he had heard everything. Daniel told me what I had suspected all along. The HOA was corrupt to its core. He had left after Evelyn struck backroom deals with developers, using the board as a front. They targeted properties with valuable land, labeled them unfit, and forced owners out. The profits were split quietly among those at the top. He had evidence, emails, contracts, bank transfers, but he had been too afraid to use them. Evelyn's power stretched beyond the neighborhood. She had connections in the county council, even in the courts. Challenging her alone had been impossible, but together he believed we had a chance. As he handed me a flash drive, his hand trembled. "Be careful," he whispered. "They don't just ruin lives with paperwork." Then he disappeared into the night, leaving me with the weight of his warning. Back inside, I plugged in the drive. What I saw confirmed everything. Emails between Evelyn and developers negotiating secret land sales. Contracts promising kickbacks in exchange for access to water rights. Even photos of private meetings held at the HOA office long after residents were told the building was closed. Meeting. It was the smoking gun I had been searching for. Proof not just of greed, but of a conspiracy that stretched far wider than one little cottage. But having the evidence and using it were two very different things. The demolition clock was still ticking. Less than 2 weeks remained. If I went public too early, Evelyn would discredit me, twist the evidence, and bury me under lawsuits before anyone could react. If I waited too long, the cottage would be gone, and with it my leverage. The tension was unbearable. Every night I heard cars creeping by the cottage. Once I found tire tracks cutting deep into the dirt by the back gate. Another time, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the yard, only to fling open the door and find nothing but shadows. Evelyn was tightening the noose, trying to break me before I could make my move. But what she didn't know was that I had already begun planting seeds. Quietly, I reached out to the neighbors who had whispered their grievances, sharing bits of the evidence. I showed them the contracts, the emails, the proof that the HOA's rules weren't about protecting the community at all. They were about lining pockets. One by one, their fear began to shift into anger. The same people who had once stayed silent started asking questions, demanding answers, whispering about rebellion. For the first time, Evelyn's grip wasn't absolute. The tide was turning. But as I stared at the glowing screen late into the night, scrolling through emails that could topple an empire, a chilling thought settled over me. If Evelyn had gone this far for land and water, what else had she done to protect her power? How many lives had already been destroyed? How many families driven out, their legacies erased, their voices silenced? The deeper I dug, the darker it became. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that exposing Evelyn wouldn't just be about saving my grandmother's cottage. It would be about unraveling an empire of corruption, built on intimidation, greed, and lies. The board thought they had me cornered, but they had underestimated something far stronger than fear. Legacy. The days following Daniel's visit blurred into a haze of tension and urgency. The flash drive he gave me had cracked the entire scheme wide open. Contracts, bribes, secret deals, all tied directly to Evelyn and her inner circle. It wasn't just about my grandmother's cottage anymore. It was about years of manipulation, neighbors forced out, and legacies erased under the guise of community improvement. But Evelyn wasn't going down quietly. The harassment intensified. Each morning I woke to find new notices shoved under my door. Violations for overgrown grass, for unauthorized curtains, even for the way my garbage bins were aligned. Fines piled up so fast, they nearly blotted out the demolition order itself. One night my tires were slashed. Another morning, I found graffiti on the fence. Leave now. I knew Evelyn's loyalists were behind it. She still had her circle, the ones who benefited from her power. They whispered in meetings, parroted her words, and sneered at anyone who questioned her. But for every loyalist, there were 10 residents simmering with anger, waiting for someone to lead them. So I decided to become that someone. I began meeting with neighbors in secret, backyards, garages, even at the cottage itself. I showed them the evidence, laying out emails and contracts on kitchen tables, as if we were plotting a revolution. At first, their eyes widened in disbelief. Then the disbelief hardened into rage. Families who had once stayed silent, too afraid to lose their homes, were ready to fight back. Stories poured out. A retired teacher whose garden was bulldozed because it didn't match neighborhood standards. A single mother nearly bankrupted by fines over her kids' bikes, left in the driveway. An elderly man whose wife had died shortly after they were forced to sell their home. Land that later appeared in Evelyn's redevelopment portfolio. The more I listened, the more I realized my grandmother's cottage wasn't unique. It was just the latest casualty in a long trail of devastation, and now we were done being victims. The plan was simple: go public. Not just to the residents, but to the entire county. Evelyn thrived in secrecy, hiding her corruption behind polished fences and glossy newsletters. If we ripped away the facade and forced her into the light, she wouldn't be able to control the narrative. But public exposure came with risk. If Evelyn sensed what we were about to do, she'd accelerate everything: lawsuits, foreclosures, even the demolition itself. We had to move fast, and we had to move smart. The opportunity came in the form of the HOA's annual community meeting, a mandatory gathering where residents were updated on budgets, projects, and elections. Evelyn loved these meetings. They were her stage, her chance to perform as the benevolent leader guiding the neighborhood to prosperity. But this time, she would be walking straight into an ambush. In the days leading up to the meeting, I quietly organized. Neighbors printed copies of the contracts. Others rehearsed testimonies about their treatment under the HOA. Daniel helped me create a timeline of corruption, a clear map showing how Evelyn had used her power for personal gain. We even contacted a local reporter known for exposing small-town scandals, making sure she'd be in the audience with her camera ready. The night of the meeting, the atmosphere was electric. The community center buzzed with more residents than I'd ever seen gathered in one place. People who had never spoken up before sat shoulder to shoulder, holding folders, papers, and determination in their eyes. Evelyn sat at the head table, flanked by her board members, her smile painted on like armor. As the meeting began, she launched into her usual performance. Charts, numbers, carefully chosen words about progress and community standards. But as she spoke, I could feel the shift in the room. Residents weren't nodding along. They were waiting, watching, ready. When the floor opened for questions, I stood. My voice carried through the room, steady despite the pounding in my chest. I laid the evidence on the table. The contracts, the county letter, the proof of bribes. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I projected copies onto the screen for all to see. Evelyn's smile faltered, but she tried to recover. She called it forged, taken out of context, desperate lies from a disgruntled homeowner. But before she could finish, another resident stood. Then another. One by one they spoke, about intimidation, about fines, about forced sales. Their voices grew louder, stronger, overlapping until Evelyn's protests were drowned in a chorus of anger. And then the reporter stood, her camera flashing as she asked Evelyn directly, "How do you explain these contracts signed under your name?" For the first time, Evelyn had no answer. Chaos erupted. Residents demanded her resignation, some pounding fists on the tables. The board scrambled, their polished composure crumbling under the weight of collective fury. Evelyn tried to gavel the room into silence, but no one listened. Her power, once absolute, was dissolving before her eyes. I watched from the center of it all, heart racing. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every family that had suffered in silence, every legacy stolen, every home lost. By the time the meeting adjourned, Evelyn had stormed out, her loyalists trailing behind her like shadows. But the damage was done. The community had seen the truth. The reporter had the story. And the foundation of Evelyn's empire was cracking. Back at the cottage that night, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and fear. We had struck a devastating blow, but Evelyn was not the type to surrender. She still had money, connections, and a demolition order set to be carried out in less than a week. The fight wasn't over. In fact, the most dangerous part was yet to come, because when people like Evelyn are cornered, they don't retreat quietly. They lash out, and I knew with a chilling certainty that she was already plotting her next move. This cottage wasn't just walls and wood. It was a promise, one I intended to keep no matter the cost. The night after the community meeting, the neighborhood seemed eerily quiet. For the first time in months, I didn't wake to find threats taped to my door. No notices, no fines, no graffiti, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Evelyn had been humiliated in front of her empire. Her control, once absolute, had cracked under the weight of truth. But I knew her too well to believe it was over. She wouldn't disappear quietly. She would fight with every weapon she had left, and she proved me right. 2 days later, heavy machinery appeared at the end of the lane leading to my grandmother's cottage. Bulldozers, trucks, a demolition crew in hard hats, papers in hand. The cottage had been marked with a spray-painted red X across the front door. My grandmother's garden, her rocking chair on the porch, the tiny window boxes she had painted by hand, all of it was about to be turned into rubble. I ran to confront them, waving the stack of evidence, shouting that the demolition was illegal, that it was under investigation. But they showed me the stamped order, still valid, signed months earlier by the county. Evelyn had found a way to push it through despite the scandal. Neighbors gathered around me, shouting, blocking the path of the machines. But the crew shrugged. They were just following instructions. Unless someone higher up stopped them, the cottage would be gone by sundown. Panic clawed at me. We had exposed Evelyn, but it hadn't been enough. If the cottage fell, the last piece of my grandmother's life, the place where she had raised her children, told her stories, lived her final days, would be lost forever. That was when Daniel appeared, breathless, holding a folder so thick it looked like it could barely stay shut. He had been working non-stop since the meeting, digging deeper into the county archives. And now he had found the smoking gun. Inside the folder was the original deed to the land, older than any HOA charter, older than Evelyn's entire operation. The cottage sat on property my grandmother had inherited, decades before the HOA was even established. Legally, it was untouchable. The HOA had no jurisdiction. The demolition order itself had been obtained through forged documents and illegal bribes. It wasn't just corruption anymore, it was fraud. We rushed the evidence to the county office, neighbors following in a caravan of cars. By the time we arrived, word of the scandal had already spread. The reporter from the meeting had published her story, and it had gone viral, picked up by local stations, then regional outlets. Cameras were waiting outside as we marched into the clerk's office. The officials didn't hesitate. With the deed in hand and the proof of fraud spread across their desks, they voided the demolition order on the spot. The red X on the cottage was declared meaningless. The bulldozers were ordered to stand down immediately. For the first time since the nightmare began, relief washed over me. The cottage was safe. My grandmother's legacy would endure, but Evelyn wasn't finished yet. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Evelyn herself stormed into the lane, flanked by 2 of her board members. Her face was pale, her eyes blazing with fury. She shouted that this was far from over, that she would appeal, that she had friends in high places who would make sure the cottage came down. But this time, she wasn't met with silence. Dozens of neighbors stepped forward, forming a wall between her and the cottage. People who had once bowed their heads in fear now stood tall, their arms folded, their voices steady. They told her it was over. They told her to leave, and for the first time, Evelyn had no power to silence them. Police arrived soon after, responding not to Evelyn's call, but to a warrant issued for her arrest. The investigation had moved quickly once the fraud was uncovered. Bribery, forgery, embezzlement, the charges stacked higher with each passing hour. She was led away in handcuffs, still spitting threats, but her words carried no weight anymore. As the police car disappeared down the road, a cheer rose from the neighbors. Some cried, some hugged. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like a community again, united not by fear, but by resilience. I stood on the porch of the cottage, staring at the chipped paint, the crooked shutters, the flowers blooming stubbornly in my grandmother's garden. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. And it had survived. In the weeks that followed, the HOA dissolved under the weight of lawsuits and resignations. A new association formed, one built on transparency and fairness, led by residents who had once been Evelyn's victims. The cottage was declared a historic landmark, protected from future development. And me, I stayed. I spent my evenings restoring the cottage, sanding the old floors, repainting the shutters in the same color my grandmother once chose. Every brushstroke felt like a victory, every nail a reminder that we had beaten back corruption and greed. Sometimes, when the night was quiet and the crickets sang outside, I swore I could hear my grandmother's voice, soft, steady, proud. The cottage had been more than a house. It had been a test. And we had passed, because in the end, Evelyn had been right about one thing. The community was powerful. She just never realized its true power wasn't hers to control. It belonged to the people, and together, we had finally taken it back.